The story of Korea's division is not simply a tale of Cold War politics or post-war boundaries drawn on maps. It is the culmination of centuries of struggle, foreign interference, and a nation's desperate fight for sovereignty that ultimately led to one of the most enduring divisions in modern history. To understand why Korea remains split today, we must journey back through time to witness how external powers systematically dismantled Korean independence, setting the stage for a tragedy that continues to unfold more than 70 years later. For most of its existence, Korea stood as a unified kingdom, proud and independent, with its own culture, language, and traditions stretching back millennia. The Korean peninsula had weathered invasions and political upheavals before, but nothing could have prepared it for the systematic assault on its sovereignty that began in the mid-19th centuries. The roots of Korea's eventual division can be traced to this period when the Hermit Kingdom's centuries-old policy of isolation began to crumble under relentless foreign pressure. The transformation began during the reign of Lee Ha-young, known as Daewon-gun, who ruled as regent for his young son, King Gojong. Daewon-gun embodied Korea's traditional resistance to foreign influence, particularly from the West. His policies were not merely xenophobic, but reflected a deep understanding of what foreign interference had done to other Asian nations. He had witnessed China's humiliation during the Opium Wars and seen how Western powers carved up territories and imposed unequal treaties. His violent rejection of foreign relations, especially with Western powers, was a desperate attempt to preserve Korean independence in an era when Asian sovereignty was rapidly disappearing. Japan, however, presented a different kind of threat. Unlike the distant Western powers, Japan was a neighbor with intimate knowledge of Korean culture and geography. When Japanese attempts at diplomatic relations failed during Daewon-gun's rule, they simply waited. The moment came in 1873 when Daewon-gun relinquished power. Japan seized this opportunity with characteristic precision, using warships to pressure Korea into signing a treaty of commerce and friendship. This was not diplomacy but coercion, the first crack in Korea's armor of independence. The opening of Korean ports to Japanese trade marked the beginning of a tragic pattern that would repeat itself over the following decades. Korea, which had previously maintained its independence while acknowledging China as a tributary relationship built on mutual respect and cultural exchange, now found itself caught between competing imperial powers. China, recognizing the threat that growing Japanese influence posed to its traditional sphere of influence, stationed troops in Korea and began a period of direct interference that transformed the peninsula into a battleground for great power politics. What followed was a humiliating series of forced treaties that stripped away Korean sovereignty piece by piece. China compelled Korea to sign trade agreements favoring Chinese merchants, while the United States pressured the kingdom into a treaty of commerce and friendship in 1882. Treaties with Britain, Russia, Germany, and France soon followed, each one opening Korea further to foreign exploitation and reducing its ability to control its own destiny. Korea had become a prize to be fought over, its own wishes and interests secondary to the ambitions of foreign powers. The forced opening of Korea unleashed internal tensions that had been simmering beneath the surface. A modernization movement emerged, but the ruling class split into factions that could not agree on a coherent path forward. The radicals, influenced by Japanese ideas of rapid modernization, staged a coup in 1884, hoping to implement sweeping reforms. Their failure after just 3 days, when Chinese troops intervened, demonstrated how completely Korea had lost control over its own political processes. Even internal Korean politics had become subject to foreign military intervention. The Lee-Ito Convention of 1885, in which Japan and China agreed to withdraw their forces from Korea, represented a brief moment of hope. Both powers promised to respect Korean independence, but this peace was built on quicksand. The fundamental problem remained unsolved. Korea had become too strategically valuable for any major power to ignore, yet too weak to defend itself against their competing ambitions. The convention merely postponed the inevitable conflict rather than resolving it. When the Sino-Japanese War erupted in 1894, Korea became the primary battleground for a conflict ostensibly fought over Korean domination, but actually representing a broader struggle for regional supremacy. Japan's victory and the subsequent Treaty of Shimonoseki in 1895 should have settled the matter, but it only invited new complications. Russia, backed by Germany and France, forced Japan to return territorial gains to China, demonstrating that Korea's fate would continue to be decided by foreign powers operating far from Korean soil. The assassination of Queen Min in 1895 by Japanese agents marked a new low in Korea's subjugation. This act of violence against Korean royalty was not merely a political assassination, but a direct assault on Korean sovereignty and dignity. King Gojong's desperate flight to the Russian legation for protection symbolized how completely Korean independence had collapsed. The King of Korea was forced to seek foreign protection on his own soil, highlighting the absolute powerlessness of Korean institutions. Gojong's attempts to play Russia against Japan by granting concessions to multiple powers represented a doomed strategy of survival through division. While temporarily extending Korean independence, these concessions sanctions further mortgaged the country's future to foreign interests. Each mining right, each logging concession, each diplomatic privilege granted to foreign powers represented another piece of Korean sovereignty sold off in a desperate bid for survival. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905 finally resolved the question of which power would dominate Korea, but the resolution came at the complete expense of Korean independence. Despite declaring neutrality, Korea was forced to sign agreements allowing Japan unlimited use of Korean territory for military purposes. The Treaty of Portsmouth, mediated by the United States, acknowledged Japanese interest in Korea without any consideration of Korean wishes or rights. President Theodore Roosevelt, later criticized for his role in legitimizing Japanese imperialism, seemed more concerned with maintaining the balance of power than protecting Korean sovereignty. Emperor Gojong's secret mission to the 1907 Hague Peace Conference represented Korea's last desperate attempt to appeal to international law and justice. The failure of this mission, with no great power willing to challenge Japanese claims, demonstrated the complete bankruptcy of international law when it conflicted with great power interests. Gojong's forced abdication in favor of his son marked the end of meaningful Korean resistance to Japanese imperialism. The annexation of Korea in 1910 was not a sudden event, but the culmination of a decades-long process of systematic subjugation. Japanese colonial rule was not merely political control, but a comprehensive assault on Korean identity, culture, and society. The closure of Korean schools, the promotion of Japanese language and culture at the expense of Korean traditions, and the systematic seizure of Korean land represented an attempt at cultural genocide that went far beyond typical colonial exploitation. The land seizure policies implemented by Japan were particularly devastating, as they struck at the heart of Korean agricultural society. By declaring that unregistered land would be forfeited and then seizing communally owned forests and farmland, Japan effectively stole the economic foundation of Korean rural life. The land was then sold cheaply to Japanese settlers, creating a colonial economy designed to benefit the occupying power at the expense of the colonized population. The March 1st movement of 1919, triggered by the death of former Emperor Gojong, represented the most significant expression of Korean nationalism during the colonial period. The peaceful nature of the protests and their brutal suppression by Japanese military forces revealed the true character of Japanese colonial rule. Tens of thousands of Koreans were arrested, killed, or wounded for the crime of demanding independence for their own country. The violent suppression demonstrated that Japanese rule depended ultimately on force rather than consent. The formation of the Korean Provisional Government in Shanghai represented Korean determination to maintain the dream of independence, even in exile. The election of Syngman Rhee as president created an alternative center of Korean political authority that would prove crucial in later developments. However, the provisional government's exile status also meant that it had limited influence on developments within Korea itself, creating a disconnect between Korean political leadership and the Korean people. Japanese colonial policies evolved throughout the occupation, sometimes becoming less overtly oppressive in response to Korean resistance. But the fundamental exploitative nature of the relationship never changed. Korea became a captive market for Japanese goods and a source of agricultural products, particularly rice, that were exported to Japan, while Koreans were forced to subsist on inferior imported cereals. This economic exploitation was accompanied by renewed cultural oppression during the 1930s and 1940s, as Japan attempted to erase Korean identity entirely. The outbreak of the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937 and then World War II intensified Japanese oppression to unprecedented levels. Koreans were forced to adopt Japanese names, worship at Shinto shrines, and abandon their cultural practices. Korean publications and academic societies were banned, while thousands of Koreans were drafted into Japanese military service or forced labor. The systematic exploitation of Korean women as comfort women represented one of the most horrific aspects of Japanese colonial rule, a crime whose effects continue to poison relations between the two countries today. The Korean Provisional Government's declaration of war against Japan in 1941 and the formation of the Korean Restoration Army represented Korean determination to participate in their own liberation. However, the Provisional Government's dependence on Chinese support and its distance from Korea meant that when liberation finally came in 1945, it arrived through foreign military action rather than Korean resistance. The defeat of Japan in 1945 should have marked the restoration of Korean independence, but instead, it ushered in a new form of foreign domination that would prove even more destructive than Japanese colonialism. The Cairo Declaration of 1943, in which the Allied powers pledged Korean independence in due course, contained the seeds of future tragedy in its deliberate vagueness. When the Korean Provisional Government sought clarification from the United States about the specifics of this promised independence, the silence they received should have warned them of troubles ahead. The Yalta Conference proposal for a four-power trusteeship over Korea revealed how little the great powers had learned from the the previous half-century of Korean suffering. The idea that Korea needed foreign tutelage before it could govern itself ignored the fact that Korea had been an independent nation for centuries before foreign interference destroyed its sovereignty. The failure to reach formal arrangements for this trusteeship reflected the growing tensions between the United States and Soviet Union that would soon engulf Korea in a new form of great power competition. The crucial moment came with General Order No. 1, hastily drafted by Americans in August 1945, which divided Korea at the 38th parallel for the purpose of accepting Japanese surrender. This seemingly administrative decision, made without Korean input or consultation, created the foundation for Korea's permanent division. The choice of the 38th parallel was arbitrary, cutting through the heart of Korea and dividing families, communities, and economic networks that had been integrated for centuries. The American decision to establish this dividing line has been interpreted as an attempt to prevent complete Soviet occupation of Korea, reflecting Cold War logic rather than Korean interests. This interpretation gains credibility when viewed against the backdrop of American policy during World War II, which consistently aimed to prevent any single power from dominating Korea. However, the unintended consequence was to create the very division that Americans supposedly sought to avoid. The political chaos that followed Japanese surrender demonstrated how unprepared Korea was for the sudden restoration of independence after 35 years of colonial subjugation. The emergence of numerous political parties in the South, all seeking self-governance, reflected genuine Korean democratic aspirations. The Committee for the Preparation of Korean Independence and the subsequent proclamation of the People's Republic of Korea represented authentic Korean attempts at self-determination. However, the American military's refusal to recognize the People's Republic and their assertion that they constituted the only legitimate government in Korea revealed how quickly liberation had transformed into new occupation. The provisional government's forced declaration that they were a political party rather than a government represented a humiliating reversal that demonstrated the continuity between Japanese colonial rule and American military occupation. The creation of a 5-year trusteeship in December 1945 by the United States, Britain, and Soviet Union sparked violent Korean opposition that should have warned the great powers about the impossibility of imposing foreign rule on a people who had already suffered decades of colonial subjugation. The establishment of the Representative Democratic Council in February 1946, headed by Syngman Rhee, represented an attempt to manage Korean discontent rather than address its fundamental causes. The parallel developments in North Korea revealed how completely the peninsula had been absorbed into Cold War competition. The Soviet establishment of a communist-controlled government, aided by expatriated Korean communists like Kim Il-sung, mirrored American efforts in the South. Kim Il-sung's arrival in Pyongyang, dressed in a Red Army uniform, symbolized how Korean political leadership had become subordinate to foreign military power. The consolidation of separate governments in North and South Korea between 1946 and 1948 represented the institutionalization of division. The Soviet creation of the Provisional People's Committee for North Korea, with Kim Il-sung as chairman, paralleled American efforts to establish friendly government in the South. Both superpowers were creating Korean states in their own image, rather than allowing Koreans to determine their own political future. The failure of American and Soviet negotiations over Korean unification reflected the broader impossibility of Cold War cooperation. When the United Nations proposed general elections throughout Korea in 1947, the Soviet refusal to allow UN Commission access to the North made clear that both superpowers preferred division under their control to unification outside their influence. The establishment of separate Korean governments in 1948 marked the formal division of the peninsula. Syngman Rhee's presidency of the Republic of Korea and Kim Il-sung's leadership of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea created two Korean states, each claiming to represent the entire peninsula, but each dependent on foreign support for their existence. The UN General Assembly's recognition of South Korea as the only lawful government in Korea, matched by Soviet recognition of North Korea, internationalized the division and made it seemingly permanent. The tragedy of Korean division lies not in the failure of negotiations or the intractability of Cold War competition, but in the systematic destruction of Korean agency over the course of nearly a century. From the forced opening of Korea in the 1870s through the establishment of separate governments in 1948, Korean wishes and interests were consistently subordinated to foreign strategic calculations. The division of Korea was not inevitable, but resulted from specific decisions made by foreign powers who treated the peninsula as a prize to be won, rather than a nation with its own rights and aspirations. Today, more than 70 years after division, Korea remains split between a hereditary dictatorship in the north and a democratic republic in the south. The human cost of this division cannot be calculated in mere statistics, but must be measured in the millions of families separated by an arbitrary line, the countless opportunities for reunification that have been missed, and the resources that both Korean states have devoted to military competition rather than peaceful development. The story story of Korea's division serves as a cautionary tale about the consequences of great power competition and the fragility of small nation sovereignty in an anarchic international system. It demonstrates how quickly independence can be lost and how difficult it can be to regain once foreign powers begin to treat a country as their playground. Most importantly, it reminds us that behind every geopolitical division lie real people whose lives have been shattered by decisions made in distant capitals by leaders who never had to live with the consequences of their choices. The question of why Korea split into two cannot be answered simply by pointing to Cold War tensions or post-war administrative decisions. The division was the culmination of a long historical process that began with the destruction of Korean independence in the late 19th century and continued through decades of foreign domination and manipulation. Understanding this history is crucial not only for comprehending Korea's current situation, but for recognizing how easily the sovereignty of small nations can be sacrificed to the ambitions of great powers. The tragedy of Korean division continues today, a monument to the human cost of treating nations as pawns in games of power and influence.